You talk a lot about crony capitalists,
Yeah.
and yet you supported the bailout of the automakers. Was that an empty Janesville assembly
No.
plant talking? And wasn't that an example of crony capitalism?
So the vote in that particular case was, we passed an energy bill, which I voted against earlier in the year, to give $25 billion to the auto companies to retool their lines to make green cars. I voted against that. That money was sitting in the Department of Energy, but it hadn't been dispersed to the companies yet. And so the bill was on the verge of bankruptcy. Cut the strings of that money and let them have that money that had already been obligated to them. Have the Energy Department push that money to the auto companies right there to get them over that moment. And the President's Chief of Staff, who I spoke with the evening before, said, if we don't pass this bill, we're going to give them TARP money. And to me, that would have been a major mistake. And I mentioned that to the President. This is the last President. I thought it would be a big mistake to open up TARP to non-financial companies. The whole point of TARP originally was to buy toxic assets, get them off to the sideline and let the plumbing clear the financial system, not to give money to manufacturing companies. And so I thought it would be a dangerous precedence, and then the liability would go up. And what happened? We passed the bill to give them the 25 from Energy Department that had already been sent and spent for the auto companies. We were just going to cut the strings so they get it right away. That got filibustered in the Senate, and then they opened up TARP, and then they gave them $87 billion. So to me, sometimes in Congress, you don't get to vote on the perfect thing. Sometimes you have to do what I guess I'd call defensive voting. You have to vote for something that you don't like to prevent something worse from happening. That happens all the time in Congress. And that's just, in a leader, this is the way I see leadership, you got to make those kinds of decisions. The easiest thing would have been just wash your hands of it, put out a press release and say, I'm not a part of this solution. But by voting against that $25 billion, you're basically voting to raid TARP for the auto companies. And so I helped pass that bill because I didn't want that to happen. And it was Republicans in the Senate filibustered that bill, so they raided TARP. And so let me say it this way. Republicans are guilty of crony capitalism too. So I'm not trying to say that we have halos over our heads on this. Republicans have done a lot of this stuff. Ethanol is a good example. Democrats as well. The problem for our party, as I see it, is Republicans got confused by being pro-business instead of pro-market. And Republicans, all of us, got in this mode where we thought, if I'm just helping the local big business, you know, Johnson Controls or Harley, I'm just making it up, and helping that business with their specific issue by giving them a carve-out or an exception, that we thought was being pro-free enterprise, when it was really being crony cap, corporate welfare. And by helping pass exceptions and carve-outs for these businesses or sectors, what we ended up doing was we raised barriers to entry against their would-be competitors, against small businesses. And so that was the philosophical problem Republicans committed. We've got to get right with that, get out of that, and go back to being pro-free enterprise, equal play, fair rules, you know, the guardrails to prevent fraud and things like that, and open markets so that new people, meaning entrepreneurs and small businesses, can enter these markets. That's what we've got to do. On the other side, I think the president is a pretty good example of a different kind of perception of capitalism, more managed or state capitalism, where it's perfectly consistent with his philosophy, I think, to use the government to prefer and put preferences of select businesses and industries. You know, green is the cool thing now, so they're bringing, you know, loan guarantees and subsidies and tax credits for select industries, and that does necessarily come at the expense of a better economic climate for others. It raises barriers to entry against competitors, and that to me is bad as well. I think Dodd-Frank is the perfect example of this gone wrong in the regulatory scheme. There's a law which basically deems the really big banks systemically risky, therefore too big to fail. They're going to go out in the marketplace and get cheaper capital than any other than M&I, which is kind of a big bank, or say a Johnson Bank or a Elm Grove's community bank, and it's going to put those guys out of business. It's going to consolidate power into those 5 or 6 banks or 10 or whatever the number is going to be. And then when they mess up, we're going to have to bail them out because they'll take the entire economy down because they're too big to fail. There's, in my opinion, an example of crony capitalism where the really large banks basically get to write their rules. They can hire the legion of lawyers to comply with all of this stuff, and all their small and medium competitors are going to go by the wayside. So that, to me, is a perfect example of crony capitalism, which I think will hurt the economy, make our financial system more fragile, and it will hurt credit going into our communities. Because in this state, credit flows best with local people dispersing it, with relationships. And if you got to go to Chase or Citigroup or Goldman, they don't know you. They're not going to customize a loan for you, for your business, and it's going to hurt the economy, I think. So that, to me, is an example of crony capitalism, where the Democrats got it wrong, and there are some examples where Republicans got it wrong.